Welcome back. So already that is leading to a lot of interpretations. People are giving it their own version of what they think may likely happen. Let's get Professor Ken Ife in. He's a macroeconomic policy analyst. He joins us from Abuja. Good morning, Prof. Thank you for joining us this morning. Already we see talks such as...
Thank you very much.
Right. Another lockdown already being discussed in different quarters. Well, yes, we know that the aviation sector, another 4 weeks for them, no one flies. That sector will have to deal with that. So people are already extrapolating, having listened to the national coordinator there. So tell us, can we afford another lockdown?
Very, very good question. But let's unpack where we are so that we can understand how we need to move forward in the context of easing down, easing the lockdown. First, we were hit by a global crisis, which translated into a supply chain disruption. And then we have supply shock. In Nigeria, it turned to demand shock. We locked down, unemployment intensified, and we are now running the risk of a collapse on aggregate demand. Then, but how has government responded? Let's look at 4 ways government has responded. Monetary policy led by CBN, fiscal policy led by the Minister for Finance. We have the humanitarian people dealing with the humanitarian led by the minister. And then you also have the PTF, that is the task force. All of these people are coming in from different angles, and we are going to bring all of them together to see how we work together to ease the lockdown. On the monetary policy side, CBN was very robust in its attempt to, one, drop an immediate palliative of $50 billion naira, and then going down to distribute that to both household, SMEs, especially MSMEs, and all of that. But it also tried to secure the financial sector so that the health crisis does not translate into a financial crisis. So boosting liquidity at the level of the commercial sector, banks. Then it summoned the private sector and got a good wind. Now, private sector in the meeting that they held, which was called Going for Growth, came out rigorously wanting to deal with infrastructure and set up an infrastructure company and looking at 15 trillion. Excellent. So that was the first level involvement of the private sector. Then we also had the 1 trillion that they had. In fact, altogether is about 3.5 trillion that the bank is putting on the table. But if they have time, we'll discuss all of that. The key thing, takeaway, is that they have started the mobilization of the private sector. And I like what your colleague was saying. Everybody should take responsibility, and I will return to that. Then on the fiscal side, you saw some softening of the tax policies, rebates, slowing down the requirements for people to send in their annual return. All of that meant to conserve cash at the level of the company so that you dissuade them from large-scale redundancies. I also note that the Federal House also passed a law, which hasn't yet been assented to try to encourage companies not to lay off and then hope to recoup some of this by tax rebates. But there are other things that the government is doing at the fiscal level. Budget review urgently brought down from $57 benchmark to $20 benchmark and rejigging all of that, and even wanting to implement the Rosanyan report on rationalization of the MDAs. Excellent. Then they're also doing something more on debt relief negotiations, vigorously pushing our side of the argument so that we are part of beneficiaries, and even going to IMF to unlock 3.4 trillion, which is part of our entitlement in that global system. So they do something positive, but there are palliatives which are spearheaded by the Ministry for Humanitarian Affairs. Obviously, they are aiming at the weakest in the community, the weakest of the weak, because those people will perish.
We will find out whether or not...
We have seen the results that over 40%...
whether or not they are hitting the target. But from that submission of yours at this opening, does that suggest we can afford another lockdown?
Oh, well, I'm just coming to address that because we need to appreciate that the work of the PTF as well, because the PTF, as you just seen now, today is in the lockdown agenda today. And I've been reaching out to them on some of the things that they could do to ease down. And also there's a economic sustainability committee led by the vice president, which is looking at ways and means in addition to the 774 times 1,000 jobs in how the public works program could meet us halfway. But all of these are not really 100% attacking the issue of lockdown and the impact of the lockdown on employment. Now, this is where your colleagues' emphasis on taking responsibility comes in. Why are the private sector not taking responsibility? Why are the employees and the employer not taking responsibility? Why are the organized private sector not taking responsibility? Now, we expect them to actually come together, NESG, the MAN, the Chamber of Commerce, the NECA, and then in fact, even yourself, the channels. You can actually mobilize these people and then get them to come with a front and a set of minimum standards for reopening the business. You don't leave all that to government. We have to say, I prepared the strategy for ECOWAS a month ago. COVID-19 private sector strategy for ECOWAS, which they are sharing with the African Union, on how the private sector can respond and how we can actually reopen the and then without compromising the health integrity. So all of this, they have to take responsibility. Now, what are they going to be in this? We need a strategy as a result of that consultation, and they should bring in the three ministers that are important here: Agriculture Minister, FMITI Minister, and then the Minister for Oil and Gas. Those people should be in that consultation, so that together they will feed to the PTF and feed to other structures, especially Ministry of Finance, on what they think we need to be doing as a minimum standard for opening up. Then at the industry level will now adopt the minimum standard and strengthen it. Because if I can give you what these minimum standards are, and I can actually give you the strategy and then give you the action plan, which I have done for ECOWAS, so that you can, I'm talking about the channel, you can lead this charge by getting these people together to talk about this. And if you say the minimum standards are A, B, C, this is all going to be based on occupational health, safety, and security in the workplace. There are about 5 protocols that could be adopted in the area of surveillance and early warning, sensitization, milestone, risk assessment in the workplace, preventive protocols, sensitization protocols, and then the intense sanitization and the availability of PPE equipment in the.
So that suggests.
And how you employ in all of those. I can give you those.
Well, we'll appreciate that.
What I'm expecting channels to actually do is to help them get these players together,
but then,
to evolve a strategy and an action plan,
just a minute,
and then negotiate that with the PTF and the sustainability group, so that we move forward. Move forward.
So
the transport union can say to you,
can you actually hear me,
given
Prof?
these standards, we don't want anybody without face mask to enter the bus.
Okay, so
and if they say that,
we'll appreciate you sending us those materials, and we'll do what we can as we progress. But from those submissions of yours, since you suggest we're not hitting the target, so can we then infer that at the moment, as things stand, we can't afford another lockdown?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I didn't get the last bit.
Since you suggest that we're not hitting the target, can we then infer that as things stand, we can't afford another lockdown?
No, we can. Of course we can. Taiwan has the lowest record. They never shut down. All they did was they took responsibility. Everybody took responsibility. They have protective gear, all of them wearing their face mask and maintaining social distances. The schools are open. The factories are open. They just took responsibility. But in addition to that, we have to have intense regime of testing, rapid testing at the workplace. If we are going to open at the workplace, and so they have to be testing, isolating, providing the gear, and then maintaining social distance. And then we have staggered 5-stage or 5-phase reopening. This is something I have suggested to the PTF, and they're looking at that, and I can share that with you. So you break them, stage them every 3 weeks interval, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and then, for example, stage 1, building sites, construction sites, agriculture, people, farmers can get back. But in any case, and in all cases, they must have the protective gear. They must maintain social distance. We know the area that we are most vulnerable. We have to have sector impact assessment of the COVID-19 impact assessment for each sector, so that we know how this sector has been battered and affected. And so when you are working your way back, you will know how to plan. It is not rocket science. But we have to take responsibility at the company level, at the organized private sector level, and at the individual level, and enforce it. But the 5-stage process actually allows states to move at different stages and at their own pace, based on the extent to which they are complying and the extent to which we are seeing the results.
Prof, if I can just ask you one question, just one moment. Prof, just one moment. Now, you say that we can afford another lockdown. But some people might argue with you on that, because, I mean, the reason why it seems like the lockdown, the relaxation of the lockdown hasn't really been effective is because of what you know about the Nigerian economy. Most of our people, they live on daily wages. So if we go back to another lockdown, how do you see that affecting the livelihood of these people?
No, there's absolutely no doubt that the lockdown we have seen is affecting the economy. There is absolutely no question about that. The second lockdown will be disaster. But what I'm saying is this: can you imagine what happened in Lagos the day you opened up? Look at the thousands of people entering the bus. Most of them didn't have protective gear. That's what I say. Apart from what the minimum standards that have been agreed industry-wide, there has to be additional specific standards for different sectors. The transport union will say, we will not have anybody enter our bus if you are not wearing face mask. The police will help them enforce that. And then you go to the factory, they say you must fully advertise and implement the protocols in every factory. You must have this, that, and it is monitored. And that's how we have to get back to work. But we have to get back to work with organized private sector doing what they need to do, which is to talk to government. We have the individual
help me understand this.
Doing.
If you say that another lockdown will be a disaster, how come you initially then say that we can't afford another lockdown?
No, the thing is, we haven't even enforced the first reopening in the cases, because what is the framework for enforcing the easing of lockdown? There's accuracy in the framework. So, but I'm saying to you that in a 5-stage framework I have just described to you, 5-stage framework where you do stage 1, allowing particular sectors. After 3 weeks, you do stage 2, allowing more sectors, and then checking that there is an enforcement, because you have to have an enforcement regime, both sector-wide and then particularly. I have tried to describe all those. Look, I can send you the strategy. I can send you the implementation plan, so that I appreciate that channels is well respected across the country, and then you can lead on this. Don't leave this thing to nobody, because all you're going to be getting is complaint. And I think you can use the media, call these people. You have convening power. Get the characters together. I've mentioned to you who these characters are, and the 3 key ministers that have to be here, beating their hand on their chest, that if we don't have farmers back, agriculture will melt down. People are planting right now. They have to go and plant. If security is an issue, they should get security. But they must enforce those minimum standards. They must have closed their nose. They must abide by the distance. And then the rapid testing have to take place in the workplace. In the workplace, not just random testing. In those workplaces that you want to open, there has to be rapid testing, and then record keeping.
Let's take a look at some of these issues. Just a minute, Prof. Some of these issues that are, the real, or if I could call it the real issues, because it's one thing to have all of those plans on paper. Yes, you talked about them trying to mobilize the private sector. But all of those mobility, all of the plans, of whatever funds that they have voted across board, do you see them addressing the informal sector? Are we getting funds to the informal sector?
Yeah. All right. Well, excellent question. The thing is that you see lots of money. You see 3.5 trillion. You see 2 more trillion coming in. Yeah, the biggest challenge is actually diffusion of that fund to the informal sector. They account for about 65% of our GDP. And are part of over 92% of the employment. And so if we are going to think about resurgence and limiting the thing, we have to address delivery of these programs and that cash to the sector. Now, I can tell you that the 50 billion naira that CBN dropped at the microfinance level to go out is actually a very good one. And then also you saw a plan, a 3-year master plan by the CBN to reach out. So they are very good plans, but you need to make sure that we're actually reaching the informal sector in a very creative and innovative way. They're doing well because there's been how many thousands? So many thousands that applied, and about 3,000 are going to get some money in the first tranche. But that is a tip of the iceberg. We need to also look at sectors like aviation. Look at what has happened to aviation. It's a complete meltdown for aviation. So we need to have to see how it has impacted on aviation and see intervention that is appropriate. And let me tell you something about the level of intervention. The level of intervention should be related to the size of the recession that you anticipate. America has put in 2.2 trillion, which is 15% or 12% of their GDP. UK 330 billion, which is 15% of their GDP. Japan 20% of their GDP. So you have to our intervention so far is around 4 trillion, 5 trillion, but we need to have at least 10 trillion, because this is only 5% or under 5% of our GDP. So this is just to give you a guidance. So whilst we are upping the game in relation to resources that are going to hit the table, we're also making sure that there's diffusion of this resource to the real sector that are suffering the unemployment, that are losing the jobs, and give us the hope of recovery. And if you have time, I can talk about agriculture, because agriculture is
just one moment before you go into agriculture. Just one moment. Prof, just one moment before you go to agriculture. You've talked about the responsibilities or what the private sector needs to do, and especially the MSMEs. But then, to a large extent, attention has been on the federal government, on the federal ministries and all of that, and the PTF, COVID-19 at the center. What responsibilities or roles do you see for the subnational, at the subnational levels, the states in particular? What roles or collaborations do you think is necessary in order for this intervention that you talk for the MSMEs to go down to where it is really supposed to be? How have you seen that play out, and how do you think it should play out? Okay,
first of all, economy is in the concurrent list. We are all equal players in the economy, state and federal. Now, what for the federal gives a strategic direction. The state takes it and runs with it, and the state is closer to the private sector. So that's the configuration. Now, when you consider a 3 or 4 or 5 stage easing up, then it has to be implemented by the states. It is the states that will say, wait a minute, this stage 1 is not working in my state. I'm not moving to stage 2 because you have not complied on stage 1. So it is the state that will eventually implement that. You can see what is going on in America, where Donald Trump is just fighting the governors. The governors are really in control. But anyway, so that's how you get the state involved. And then when you now come to specific intervention, like you're going to look at agriculture, if you have time to look at that, it is the state that will lead. Because what you require, the sea change, or the seismic change you expect in agriculture, has to be led by the private sector, working strongly with the states. The federal is just there to ease the burden, to make sure that the export channels and all of the areas where they have control and policies, of course, fiscal and monetary policies, are all in sync. So that's how I see the states coming in. But the private sector, I'm afraid, have to do more. They really have to do more, because they're sitting back and making us feel that the government has to do everything. Government is expecting the input of the private sector. And we need to do more, both at the level of the organized private sector and the specific industry and industry. So we have to do more to encourage government.
Just one moment,
to help us in the private sector.
Just one moment. Are you saying that the private sector and the state governments are not cooperating sufficiently?
I haven't said that. What I'm saying that they will collaborate more effectively if there are frameworks that are clear and they can work with. I have just given you an example of a framework in which the state can take effective control. And then I also talked about a framework and a strategy and an implementation framework where the private sector strategy can work, driven by the private sector, and then with the buy-in of the federal government. So that, I've described those two scenarios. And in both cases, the state is working far more closely with the private sector to ensure that what we require to revive the industry or even to stop the rot is on board.
Wind down this conversation and, get the recommendations all tied together. By the way, we expect that, recommendations you said you have, but you wanted to talk about agriculture and you make it sound as though there's a treasure chest right there. So if you could just talk about that briefly. What is this thing about agriculture that you're excited about?
Look, in terms of strategy, what you do is you compare yourself to your peers. And then you find who is 2 or 3 times ahead of you in terms of GDP growth rate and shadow. That is shadow economics. Now, what we have, the country that is our peer is Brazil. It's not South Africa. It's not Egypt. It's Brazil because they are in exactly the same agroecological zones as ourselves. 300 million people. We are 202 million people. Don't forget that the Nigerian component there is almost 100 million. But look at the agriculture. Brazil is 2019, they earned $151 billion in agriculture. This year, their target is $200 billion. And they are growing exactly the same product that Nigeria is growing. I can give you the details. In sugar, 43 billion, 33 billion okay, now look at Netherlands. Netherlands they haven't got what we've got, but they are earning $100 billion in just vegetable alone, using aquaponics, greenhouses, and hydroponics. That is not even using the ordinary soil that we have. Then you look at Japan. Japan imports literally everything that they eat. China imports $80 billion on food. 41 billion is from America. So, where are we? Where are we as a country? Look at the FAO recorded Nigeria as one of 5 countries in the world that can actually produce more food than they require. Brazil is not even in that league, but certainly the only one in Africa. But the problem is that once we produce so much, 30 to 70% can't make it into the food chain. And there's so many problems. I can list them here. They have to do with infrastructure, the power, the transportation, and all of that. And the lack of serious investment in processing and of agro-processing. And if you look at GDP composition, agriculture is about 25%, 22 to 26%. Then the services is 54. Then industry is 22. The weakest link in our production system, in our whole economy, is the link between agriculture and processing. That is agro-processing. And so what you see is that the traders have expressed themselves in that chain and now importing to subsidy. And that is what is happening. Now, when we produce, what we produce walk away to the neighboring francophone countries, and because we don't have the capacity to process them, so we are exporting the jobs.
What we do?
Come back 3-4 months later with 100% increase in the price, even though we have strategic grain reserves all over the country.
All right,
literally,
we're going to break now, but we'll just get your concluding thoughts on the francophone or West African neighbors. Now, how do we leverage on that moving forward? In conclusion, that's in a moment. Stay with us. It's our concluding moments now with Professor Ken Ife. Talking about our West African neighbors. I mean, the other time, the figures coming through from the World Bank, when they say, look, 75% of our revenue will be used to service debts up until 2024. That's concerning for everyone. And then the country talks about us having a funding challenge. So how do you think? Because, I mean, if you really look at it, Nigeria's economy is West Africa. Many of them depend on a lot of what happens here, impacts hugely on West Africa. Are we leveraging on that? If not, what do you suggest we should be doing to leverage on that?
All right, 2 things, really. First of all, in relation to what you said about World Bank, that 75% of our revenue would go to servicing debt in 2024, that's possible. But the thing is this, we have more money outside the banking sector than we have. And then that brings us to this informal economy. We could, in the context of the national savings schemes, special ones designed, we're working on that right now, and government is pushing. We could get more of that money into the system so that the government can borrow against those monies and prosecute the infrastructure projects and all of that with less recourse to foreign borrowing. So that's number one. But let's come to the impact of our neighbors and things. What it is that they are protected by, we are surrounded by four francophone countries, and 5 years ago, 1 naira could buy 3 francs CFA. Now I can only buy 1.5. That's devaluation, over 50%. So what we produce here is cheap to them. They don't need to grow any food anymore. I mean, not that many of them have better agricultural medicine than us, but they are importing our food. But the thing is that they repackage it, dry it, and bring it back again, and make huge profit, 100% to 200%. So it's not a crime because they are protected by ECOWAS Treaty on free movement. But the thing is, look how happy everybody was in Nigeria when we released 75,000 metric tons of food from our strategic reserve. Now, if we were releasing that every week, nobody would be talking about this situation possibly going to arise. But the thing is, in every state, most of the states, we have either 25,000 metric tons silo or we have 100,000 metric tons silo. So we, in theory, should have been able to, if we had been processing our grains and storing them, not only maintains the price stability, maintain inflation at single digit, but also can release that 75,000 ton every week. Nobody will be talking about food security. But the thing is that we are not. And we have the capacity. Many of those silos are still in completion, not completed. Some are completed. Let's look inwards. The answer to our problem is look inwards. We have the capacity. Let me tell you this. We have the correct model of farming that will make us beat Brazil. Why? Anchor Borrowers program of the CBN has shown that as an anchor, as an aggregator, as a processor, as an exporter, you can work with 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 farmers at 1 hectare and then aggregate. The model is there. The finance is there. We have over 4 trillion sitting there, intervention funds ready to help. The market is there. We have 202 million people. We have enough. Many of the countries we are talking about don't even have agriculture because they don't have the land. Then in terms of the political will, of course, the political will is there, but the private sector have to rise to the challenge. We really have to do that.
You speak about us having the infrastructure
alone.
And capacity to do all of these things. Remember that if the DMBs were able, if people could access those credit via the DMBs, I'm not sure the Anchor Borrowers program would have come on stream or would have been there. So in terms of access to credit, and then having that structure, because they talk about the value chain not really being there for the farmers, because if you really get into the farmers and ask some of these challenges, it's still very much huge. And so it's not as effective as perhaps you suggest some of them tell us.
Well, you're right. You're right. That's why it is a moving target. And I said to you, there's also, I'm talking to government on some other alternative platforms that can aggregate the money from intervention funds with a capital market, a national savings kind of scheme, and a development assistance, 3 different pots, and bring them together and head down to unpack the challenges with the informal sector. So you can have a delivery mechanism that is dedicated to informal sector, but collapse all the resources from the 3 segments I have just mentioned. So that is on there. And the government is very, very interested, and they're looking at it. So one thing I have to tell you is this. We have a government that listens, but we have to up our game. We have to bring the proposals, it's not rocket science, and talk to them. Just as I'm telling you about all this easing the lockdown, we have to wake up with our sectors. Look at how robust the intervention was during the CBN going for growth. Over 500 private sectors were there. I was there. And look at how it went. It played well. Then look at how the private sector came together, want to raise money, and it's playing well. Now let's get them, encourage them to do more now in relation to easing the lockdown.
Okay, perhaps maybe at this point
talk about reasonable framework, so minimum standards, and then we'll move.
Tell us at this point, then, Prof, what do you actually mean when you say the private sector should actually do more? Because many of them are complaining that, look, they're hard hit by the economy globally. So
no, it's not that.
Okay.
Everybody is hard hit. You're probably missing my message. My message is this: who is talking to government? How can you get the organized private sector? I just mentioned a few of them. NESG plus the Chamber of Commerce, ENECA, and then some key industry captains to talk to the ministers. I've mentioned 3 ministers at the minimum, FMITI, Agriculture and Petroleum, so that they can all agree on a strategy and an implementation framework for easing down, and then lock it into the 5-stage easing down, which the PTF is looking at the moment. Somebody should be advising government and dialoguing with government on what we think we could do, and then taking this as minimum standard out there into the industry, and have particular industries add more peculiarities to the minimum standard. I gave you an example: the transport companies, what they could add, and then also the factories, what they could add. And I've also given you protocols, about 7 protocols in the reopening. So there are all these things. If you don't go to government and help them and dialogue with them, then you can sit down and wait for them to do. They have so much on their plate, and I've given you a litany of the things that government is doing on fiscal, monetary, humanitarian, and global, and the health. They're doing something. Please don't.
You're also not unaware.
Our responsibility
just one moment.
At the individual level, Prof. At the firm level, at the OPS level.
Just one moment, Prof. You are not also unaware of the fact that, you have talked about the organized private sector, the OPS, but how in the scheme of things where Nigeria's economy is concerned, you also talked about the fact that the MSMEs make up some 65-70% of our GDP. How impactful will an organized private sector-led conversation with government be on an uneducated, largely uneducated MSME sector?
MSME sector is led by organized private sector. You have NASME, you have NASI, you have MAN, you have all the people leading these MSMEs. And those are the ones who will talk constructively to government on how we're going to ease down. Let's sit back and let PTF decide how to open up the industries. It's not fair. We have to tell them and negotiate with them how we going to
if you don't mind.
That.
Prof, just one moment. Now, you've talked about the fact that the MSMEs are led by the people who are well informed about these things, but
organized
on a number of times on this program,
sector.
just one moment, on this program, on a number of times we have had conversations with practitioners in the MSME sector, and they keep telling us, that even when we had them with the organized private sector, it's not usually very, very friendly, if you like, a conversation, because on the one hand, just as Chimelin said, the organized private sector say they are hard hit, and it's not so easy for them to access, facilities that will help them to embrace the MSMEs as they ought. So going back to the conversation about the MSMEs, how ready are the MSMEs to embrace whatever it is that the organized private sector come up with if they are not well informed about it?
Well, of course, you are in the media. When you talk about informing, it is about the media sending the message. But you have to help the media. If you don't give media a template of how we're going to go forward, you will have nothing to communicate and sensitize. So, but what I'm saying is that you don't expect the 47 million SMEs to give 47 million voices to the government on what they want. That's why you have organized private sector. They will have to speak up and go and have this meeting, which I have told you to facilitate, so that we can come up. And it's not that I'm not giving you chasing wild goose. I will give you the material so you can look at that, because so that they can come very, very quickly with a plan, and the government will implement. I can tell you that the government is ready to implement anything you give to them that makes sense and that is self-regulating, and also make sure that everybody takes responsibility. And that responsibility
just one last thing.
3 tiers.
Prof,
both
just
at the
one last
state
thing.
level,
Just one last thing,
firm
Prof.
level, and
Just
at the
one
individual
moment.
level.
Just one moment, Prof. You've talked about subnational, national, and international considerations that we need to have as far as ECOWAS is concerned, and perhaps also as far as the AU. Now, give us your word on this. We have a challenge on 3 strata: social crisis, health crisis, economic crisis. Health crisis that has produced social disruptions and economic disruptions all over the world. But coming back to Nigeria, how have we handled the balance of our social crisis, the health crisis, and the economic crisis? And what do you recommend we do urgently?
Well, there is a preponderance of support to the social sector. There's no doubt about that. But having said that, the jury is out on how much more could be done for the private sector unless the private sector takes control, takes responsibility, both at the firm level, at the individual workers level, and at the organized private sector level. Then, of course, in terms of the health challenge, the PTF is doing their best. You could see their frustrations on how some states are letting the things loose and all that stuff. But we are trying to help the PTF by saying to them, adopt this framework of 4-5 stage discipline, and then the private sector needs to have to come in and lock in with their own framework on the, we have to work together. You can't do it separately. We are all being decimated by what is going on, and we can't sit back and do blame game, pass buck. No, the three have to work together. And we have to appreciate that the government has limited resources, but is there to provide the leadership. And we need to take responsibility. Taiwan just took responsibility at the individual level and at corporate level. And there's only three things: massive testing, then headgear, and social distance. That's all that they did. They never had any lockdown. And all the factories are operating. They are the ones supplying COVID-19 kits to everybody in the world.
In consideration of your submissions.
Sweden has done the same.
If you can hear me, in consideration of your submissions, and if you can advise... can you hear me, Prof? Now, in consideration of your submissions, and if you were to advise the PTF on COVID-19, should they consider another lockdown? Will that be a yes or no?
No, I'm not going to. It's not a yes and no answer because every state is different. They are not, okay, for example, Lagos State is doing their very best. But of course, Lagos State is a melting pot. So every state is different. If you implement a 4-5 stage thing, the states are going to be at different level. So by opening up, some are in stage 2, stage 3, some are still in stage 1 because they have not convinced the governor that they are compliant. So they will all be at different stages. And I know that Lagos, with all the problems and challenges they have the capacity to be running to stage 4 within the next 1 month. So this is the point. This is the point. It's not rocket science, and all of us you can't have one solution fit all. So that's the point.
So, Ken, if a macroeconomic policy analyst, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts this morning. All right, and so we'll be back in just a moment.
My pleasure, and thank you for...
Stay with us. All right.